Well, we talked about assessment types, and so now let's go into some assessment policies that you can have in place in your classroom. Now, again, keeping in mind our overall purpose, which is that we want to show content mastery of the grade level standards. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to explore these different policies that you could have in place. The first one is late work policy. This is always a big discussion, I think, in departments. What do we do with late work? And here's my idea: avoid it in the first place. You don't have to have late work. In my classroom, there's only one assignment in a whole quarter that can possibly be late. Nothing else can be late. Um, Now, we have kind of the luxury in the math classroom where we can not only give students advance notice of any out of class summative assessments that are coming up. For me, that's a project at the end of the quarter, but we don't have to have many out of class summative assessments. In an English classroom, or social studies, or even in some cases science classes, they're going to have more out of class assessments. They're going to have to go home, they're going to have to write about stuff. But in a math classroom, in many cases, we can take care of our assessments right there in class and guarantee that the student is getting it done in class, and that it's not their parents doing it for them, it's not somebody else helping them, it's actually that student. I had a college professor who once said, any assessment that leaves your classroom is not an assessment at all. And I would tend to agree with that because we don't know for sure where it came from. So I just avoid late work. Since my homework is worth 0%, my homework completion is worth 0%, my homework accuracy is worth 0%, my mastery tasks in class even are worth 0%. Since all those things are worth 0% of a student's summative grade, then if it's late, then I just leave that zero in the grade book. It's not harming their grade, it's just data to say they didn't have it done there on time. And like I said, follow those policies we talked about back in the previous video with homework. If they didn't get it done, it depends on what the homework purpose was, and then maybe they'll have to redo it, maybe they don't. But it depends on that individual student and the individual assignment that you gave. So just avoid late work. Okay, and then you don't have to worry about it. Have benchmarks for due dates of assessments that are going to be out of class so that you can build students up to that. And again, just reduce the amount of out of class summative assessments that you have. If an assessment that is summative is turned in late, then be flexible depending on the circumstances. I do recommend having a written policy in place. I don't know. Here's one. You can say minus 10% to a grade, and it's only accepted up to a week late. But I think I have a written policy that looks like this, but I don't think I've ever actually followed it. Because the problem with a late grade is that if you reduce the level, whether it's traditional grading, A, B, C, D, or standards-based grading, median exceeds or something like that, if you're reducing a student's grade because it is late, that's not an accurate reflection of content mastery. Okay, now it's an important skill. We need to teach kids to not be late. They need to be doing homework when it's assigned. They need to be doing projects when it's assigned and get it done in an acceptable time frame. But by the same token, if it is late and when they turn it in, we still have to know what level of content mastery do they have. And so, generally speaking, again, I just avoid it. I don't have late work, so it doesn't particularly matter in my classroom. You might just note it in your grade book. If it's a formative assessment, you could say, hey, this is late, and then you can look at how many times have we had a late grade. That's again formative information for parents and students to look at to go, boy, I've got a problem in this area and I need to fix that. All right, what about cheating? And what do you do with cheating? Because obviously we want to know what an individual student knows. So what do we mean by cheating? Well, I tell the students that if you're explaining on a formative assessment, if you're explaining what to do or just giving an answer without explaining why we do it, okay, then that's cheating. Because the why is the important part. If on a formative assessment like homework, if you're explaining why we do something, then you're actually helping that person learn. That's called tutoring. That's helping. It's called collaboration in the real world, is what that's called. Okay, so just to flat out do it, no, that's bad. But if you can talk about it, if you can explain it to each other, that's great. That's not cheating on a formative assessment. Now, on a summative assessment, if you're explaining what to do or just giving an answer, even if you do explain why, it doesn't matter. It's not representative of what that individual student knows. It's representative of what you know because you're just giving that answer to this other student. And so that's cheating. All right, so what happens when we do cheat on these summative assessments? What are going to be the consequences? Well, if it's a formative assessment and they're just doing the homework for somebody else, well, I'm probably going to notify the parents, and the natural consequences are going to show up when we get to summative assessments. So I'm going to tell the student, I'm going to say, look, you were cheating on this homework assignment. You know, somebody else did it for you. You didn't do anything. How do you think you're going to do once we get to quizzes, tests, or problem solvings, or quarter exams, or projects? How are you going to do on any of those other assessments that are coming up? And that student's going to know they're not going to do that well. And again, part of our job as educators is to teach students that they have to make good and right choices in their educational career to be successful, to really learn this. And so they're going to have natural consequences. They're going to show up. Okay, I'm not going to put a 0 in the grade book because of this. And it's formative. Now, what if it's summative? If it's summative and they have cheated on it, they've taken an answer from somebody else, well, I have to know. I have to be able to summarize their level of learning. So usually I'll have them take a different version of the assessment. We'll make a new version of that test. Most of the tests or quizzes that we have, we've got an alternate version that we use either for a test retake or something like that. So I can utilize that if a student is cheating because I have to get at what summarizes their level of mastery. What about the no zero policy? There was a huge push again, just like there was, oh, you got to get rid of all homework. Now it's we got to get rid of all zeros. And people said, well, zero's an outlier, and therefore you should never give a 0 on anything. The lowest score you should give is 50%. Well, that's ridiculous. If the lowest score we give is a 50%, then of course no student is going to fail because we've just given them extra credit to 50%. If 60% is your cutoff for a D minus. So my question is what's the 0 for? Okay. If the student really knows 0% of the content, then 0 is the best reflection of their content mastery. So if we're only taking a grade on the summatives, then we don't care if 0 is an outlier. It's representative of their content mastery on that particular topic or skill. Okay. The problem really is that I think where this no 0 thing came from was that students were failing because they were not doing the homework. And so everybody was giving 0s for all this homework, and they said, "Well, we can't do that because then no student has a chance because we have so much homework, and these are all 0s." Well, no kidding, but that's because homework is formative assessment. We shouldn't have been giving it a grade in the first place. If we weren't giving it a grade in the first place, then we wouldn't have had this problem with the 0s. Because on a summative, if they don't know anything, then that's what we want to report because we want an accurate reflection of what students know. Okay, giving a lower bound of 50% skews the grades much higher. Think of a student who's got 6, 10, 80, 10 as 4 scores. Run the average on that and then run it again by replacing the 10s with 50s. Going to way bump up their grade. This is just another way to get extra credit in there so that we can push kids through the system even though they actually don't know what they're doing. And that goes back to our standards and the fact that we actually, as a society, really don't care if students know the math. We just care about the appearance of them knowing the math. So if we can take these 10% and bump them up to 50s, then they've got the appearance of at least being able to pass. We don't really care if they actually know the math or not. We just want to push them through the system, which is not good. And I think we need to change that. So anyway, in the case of no 0s, we probably need a 0 in this case. Other people say any 0 that you have should be redone until the student passes it. Well, that's impossible. There is just no time to do this. What if a student gets 0s on everything and then the last week of school says, you know what, can I just redo every single assignment from the whole year during this next week and pass this course? No. Okay, summative assessment means at this time, when I've expected mastery, where are you at? I want to establish that with reliability and validity. So if it is a 0, then hey, that's a 0. We're going to talk about something you might use in place of redoing it until the student passes. What I would say is if you were using formative assessments correctly, you would know that this student was in trouble and you would not give them the summative until they were ready for that. Okay, so that we would have made corrections before this would be the best thing to do. What I do is I give one chance for a retake on assessment, and on any quiz or test or anything like that, students get one chance to retake that assessment, and it replaces the old grade completely. And to do that, they have to do a three-step process. They first of all have to correct the old assessment. They second of all have to create some new problems on their own and solve them. And then the third thing is they have to sit down with me for a one-on-one interview and convince me with the problems that they've created and then other knowledge just through talking. They have to convince me that they've actually increased their content mastery. And then if they do all three of those things to my satisfaction, then they've earned the right to retake an assessment. And in this sense, then, I never give a student a retake unless I'm sure that they're ready to succeed. Okay, and so this guarantees, basically this process guarantees that they're going to retake at a higher level, and it's going to increase their scores, their summative scores. It also weeds out those kids who just don't care about the assessments in the first place, because what we don't want to do is train kids to say, it doesn't matter what I get on this test because I'll just bomb this test, take a look at it, then study for a retake, which will look a lot like this one. Well, no, now there's a big process attached to it, and so most of those kids who, dare I say, have kind of a lazy trend maybe, which is understandable, in them, it eliminates that because they don't want to go through all that big long process because it's too much work. So therefore they take the first test more seriously in the first place. So I do think retakes on tests or quizzes or other assessments is valuable as a policy, and then you don't have to worry about redoing a zero until a student passes. Instead, they've got a chance to do it and to show that they have increased their content mastery. And really, as I said, the no zero policy came about because teachers gave zeros for formative assessments and counted towards a student's grade. So the actual problem was counting a formative as a summative, not the fact that there were zeros. So if we fix the whole formative versus summative thing, we fix the no zero policy. Okay. So I would say use zeros, but use it correctly. Why would you give a zero for a summative? If it's incomplete, well, we don't know. So make the kid come in and complete it. If they refuse to complete it, then hey, you know what? Our best guess probably is a zero. The zero stands. Is the zero there because they totally lack any mastery? Well, fine. Then it's a zero. They deserve that zero. What if it's for cheating? Well, no. If they're cheating, that doesn't actually represent their content mastery. So I'm not going to give them a zero for cheating. Instead, they're going to come in and retake a similar assessment. Is it late? I'm not going to give them a zero for being late because that doesn't demonstrate content mastery. Instead, that demonstrates their lateness. So I'm going to actually assess what's there and then make a note of it being late. But as I said, we can avoid late grades in the first place anyway, for the most part. Okay, why is it late? If it's cheating, look at that consequence, and if it has to do with effort, then that's a formative assessment and a formative issue that we need to address as far as work habits, study skills, self-regulation skills. Group grades. If you're using group grades, this is probably a problem because, and let me get the definition here, giving the same grade or just slightly modified grades to each student in a group. Okay, what does group grade measure? Well, it doesn't measure content mastery. It can, but probably only for one student, and we never know which one. Okay, were you the person who did all the work for all of your groups, or were you one of the slackers who just let somebody else do it? You all know each one of those types of people, and you know that you have students like that in your class for both. So does it show content mastery for all those students? No, it's not summative. Okay, this is going to be a formative learning exercise if they're working in groups, not summative. So instead, have students discuss ideas in a group first. But one of the things I do is I say, okay, you can talk about it, but you can't write anything down. Now split up and go on your own, and individually now start solving the problem. So they get together to brainstorm some solution paths, they get together to brainstorm some ideas for how to solve this problem, and then they go about it on their own. or have them do some group work and throw that away, and then they go to a summative assessment that's on their own, that's similar to that group project that they just did. Or just use a group grade as a formative or discovery task on your own. It doesn't have to be something that's a test type environment or a project. It might just be a learning activity. What do we do with partial credit? I believe that partial credit is pretty important, because if we look at this problem here, we're solving an algebraic problem. Here's a mistake, but was it an algebraic mistake? No, absolutely not. The student understood inverse operations. They knew that with that -7, they needed to add 7 to both sides, because -7 plus 7 would quote unquote cancel each other out. It actually becomes 0, right? The additive identity. And what the mistake that they made was adding integers. So here's a student where I would give partial credit, because if my grade level standard is about inverse operations, that they actually have, and it looks like they have that mastered. It's just the computation that's not there. And so the reason I feel comfortable still taking off points for the computation is because obviously we do need a right answer. Okay, out in the real world we want good answers out there. And precision, to is one of the mathematical practice standards to get to a degree of precision that works for that particular problem. And so obviously we'd want the precise answer here in this case to actually be -2. So maybe this is worth 3 out of 5 points, because the student actually has the inverse operations down, and so I want to be able to understand that and evaluate that correctly in that sense. Test retakes, I've kind of already talked about this, so I'm going to zoom through this. And I told you about the process that I go through. So if a student does retake a test, what should we do with that though? I told you that I completely replaced the grade. Some people average the two grades, and I know that acknowledges the struggle, but it doesn't necessarily show their current level of content mastery where they're at right now. So I tend to replace it instead of average it. How many times can a student retake a test? Like I said, in my class, you just get one shot at it. It's impractical to allow lots of multiple retakes. You'll have students all the way up until the last day trying to retake 3 or 4 or 5 assessments to try and bring up their grade at the last minute. So we want to be training responsibility and timeliness into students. And so I would follow that 3-step process, like I mentioned, where they correct the old assessment, they create problems on their own, and they sit down with you for a one-on-one interview to convince you that they've increased their content mastery. What about common assessments? Should you have common assessments across the grade level or the course? I think this is really important. If we have, we want to establish some intergrader reliability on assessments, okay, so that if a student's in one class versus the other, that they're getting basically the same grade. And I would even go so far as to say, you can definitely count these as your type 2 or type 3 assessments for your teacher evaluations that have to be in place with the para requirements. And it's also a good discussing point for student mastery. I know the other 8th grade teacher and I were always saying, well, what about how'd your kids do on this quiz or do on that quiz? And we have good conversations because we have the same quiz. We give the same quiz every week. We give the same tests at the end of every unit. And we even give the same partial credit. We line that out together. How are we going to give partial credit on each of these problems? And we just have a fantastic working relationship through building these things together, and it helps us to discuss where the students are at and to push them further into their student mastery. So I think common assessments are a great thing to utilize no matter which assessment you're using, what assessment type. I would say this is a good policy to have some common assessments, either weekly or mid-chapter quiz, a unit test, a quarter or semester exams, whatever it happens to be. Alright, so if you want to take some time to check out and reflect on the different assessment policies that we have, again, that you can download that paper, and then we'll be back for the next section where we talk about different grading systems.